If you wish to support the channel on Patreon, please follow the links below, and be sure to click the bell so you don't miss any of my videos. Did you know that this month is this channel's 6th anniversary? Yep, the first review proper came out in May 2012 and there's been hundreds since then. Like seriously, hundreds. Mostly of action games or sports or strange things that aren't easily classified, and perhaps the odd RPG. Of all the genres though, point and click adventure tends to get covered the least. It's been years and I can count the vids I've done for point and clicks on one hand. I think it's now 5 thanks to the game we've got today. Full Throttle, another one that's been requested. So, happy 6th anniversary I suppose, and let's just get down to it. Full Throttle is an adventure game from LucasArts that came out in 1995, and it was written by a guy who pretty much everybody knows, Tim Schafer. Schafer had gradually made his way up the company. His first significant role was co-writing most of the dialogue on The Secret of Monkey Island with Dave Grossman, and from there he and Grossman co-designed the awesome Day of the Tentacle, a game that I will eventually have to get around to. Despite his involvement in both of these classics, Full Throttle is officially Tim Schafer's debut as solo lead designer. Full Throttle represented a shift for LucasArts. Technically it's the first game they made that was distributed on CD-ROM only, meaning the game could fully embrace newer technology, meaning motion video and the like, which you will see at various points. Stylistically though, it's also very different from just about anything LucasArts had done previously. The 90s LucasArts, quite possibly one of the most loved game development teams of all time, had a pretty simple set of directives from their boss, you know, George Lucas. Lucas himself wasn't massively hands-on with the company, he wasn't much of a games person and trusted people to handle that, but he simply said that he wanted everything that LucasArts released to be as high quality as possible. Not that commercial success wasn't nice or anything, but LucasArts could have obviously made more money if they'd focused on crapping out various generic license games based on their already existent IPs, as opposed to what they actually came up with. Even for the ultra-successful film franchises, in a world filled with endless lame tie-ins, the likes of Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis and TIE Fighter seriously stand out. It's a whole different league. In fact, it's a whole different sport. The same applied to the original games. Quality was key. LucasArts may not release as much as other studios, but everything they do release will be of the highest standard. And even with that as the focus, LucasArts' hit rate in the 90s was frankly astonishing. They virtually never missed. They just had that many crazily talented people working for them, collaborating with each other and making classic after classic. Not just the scum-based adventure games that we're mostly looking at here, but the action games too, the likes of Zombies and Metal Warriors, or others like the SNES Star Wars and Indiana Jones games that involved folks like Sculptured, Jalico and Factor 5. As for the adventures though, they did often share some traits. They could mostly be enjoyed by everyone, they'd be packed with comedy but never too edgy or near the knuckle, they'd often be pretty cute. You could imagine them as movies, but they'd be good zany comedies, occasionally fantasies or sci-fis. Full Throttle is a little different to that. In many ways it's seen as LucasArts' first adult game. The humour, characters and setting have much rougher edges than anything you'd find in, say, Monkey Island. There's plenty of violence too. It's not completely over the top, there's no swearing or sawed off limbs or anything like that, but it's certainly aimed more towards older teens and adults than it is to people of all ages in the way that their earlier games were. As such, the game represented something of a risk for LucasArts. By this stage they had a solid business model. Most of their adventures would be modest commercial hits, usually selling a couple of 100,000 copies. Full Throttle would likely break that mould in some way, although which way would depend on whether it was a hit or a hash. But for now, well, it's an adventure, so we can't not get into the story. Full Throttle is set in an unspecified area of the American Badlands and focuses on a character named Ben, leader of the Polecats, a motorcycle club. They, along with most of the other clubs, proudly ride Corley motorcycles, the last domestic manufacturer of such machines. The old and terminally ill boss of the company, Malcolm Corley, happens to come across the gang while en route to a shareholders meeting, and he stops at their post, the kickstand, to share some stories. much to the annoyance of the company vice president, Adrian Ripburger. Ripburger tries to get Ben to accompany the limousine to the meeting with his polecats, and even though his intentions are quite clearly noble and not shady and dishonest in the slightest, Ben declines, saying that the polecats are not for sale. So Ripburger escalates the negotiations by having Ben knocked out and impersonated by his burly right-hand man Nestor, giving them the escort and leading the polecats right into an ambush. Ben himself has his bike sabotaged while in hot pursuit as a way of presumably tying up a loose end. However, he doesn't die, and he and his bike are brought back to health by a mechanic named Maureen in the town of Melonweed. And so the game begins in earnest, as Ben tries to figure out how to save his gang, and to stop Ripburger from taking Corley Motors over and, well, essentially ruining them. One thing that should be noted is that Full Throttle is often erroneously described as a post-apocalyptic game. Now, while it does take a lot of inspiration from a post-apocalyptic series, Mad Max, the game itself isn't, and there's no evidence of a big global war or anything like that. Full Throttle is laid out like a classic biker tale, one you would hear in a bar somewhere, perhaps with a good few embellishments thrown in and what have you, and indeed this was apparently the origin of the idea for the game. And if it's really about anything, then there's lots of counterculture and individual rebellion. The world of Full Throttle is actually very small indeed, perhaps smaller than any other LucasArts game up to this point, especially if you were to make a screen-by-screen map of it. There is a world outside of the game's boundaries, and you do see bits of it, the suits and the flying cars and all that. Corley Motors isn't the last domestic motorcycle manufacturer because of war or whatever. It's because everybody else moved on. These machines are seen as obsolete, and everyone else in other places drives virtually identical flying cars. Ripburger wishes for Corley Motors to become a part of that, and doesn't care about the legacy of biking or any of that shit. He wants to make money. The polecats consciously reject that, and choose to stay out of that world, and ultimately Ben will do his damnedest to make sure Corley keep making bikes, because even in the future, there are still 1%ers. Thinking of Full Throttle as a post-apocalyptic game doesn't really make sense. Thinking of it as a game set in the future, but in a small part of the world that hasn't moved on from the present, does make sense. The art style of the game is, compared to a lot of other LucasArts games, actually quite muted. A lot of it is dark and moody, and the nights actually feel very much like night. Again, that's different. Even the nights in games like Secret of Monkey Island and Day of the Tentacle feel vibrant because there's still lots of light around to play with, whereas here there's noticeably less because the setting is so much more barren. But the real big break from other LucasArts games comes in the characters themselves. So often the first notable thing about LucasArts characters is the eyes. They're always so big and full of expression, even when they're hidden behind glasses. It seems as though Tim Schafer decided to make a LucasArts game without them, as almost all the characters basically have no eyes at all, nor particularly animated expressions. The world of Full Throttle, and particularly its main character, Ben, is gruff and stoic, not exactly used to showing much emotion. Everyone sees the world through a squint, it seems. But that really stands out. The lack of facial expressions, or even facial features in some cases, manages to make the characters even more memorable than usual. Ben in particular is a fine creation, one of the best LucasArts protagonists for my money. Apparently inspired by a mix of both Mad Max and Sanjuro from Yojimbo, Ben's first real action that you control in the game is to grab a barkeep by his nose ring and slam him down. And it just goes from there, really. His voice, gravelly and gruff, is perfect, as is the understated way he goes about business. Apparently in auditions, a lot of people played Ben with a lot of shouty attitude, but it was Roy Conrad who got it dead on, recognising that he's a man who gets things done, ideally with as few words as possible. A classic Charles Bronson, Clint Eastwood type hero who doesn't even need a last name, although apparently it is Throttle. However, his last name was dropped due to fears that the creators of Biker Mice from Mars, which featured a character named Throttle, would sue, believe it or not. Anyway, Bill's gruff and to-the-point nature is also reflected in another big change, the streamlining of the UI. Now, you're used to all sorts of commands in LucasArts games: talk to, give, take, drop, examine, pick up, and so on. Ben has 4: eyes, mouth, hand, foot. The eyes look, obviously. The mouth is mostly for talking, but does have other uses. The hand picks things up or pushes and all that, and the foot is used for pretty much nothing but kicking. It wouldn't really do for Ben to have a great deal of commands at his disposal. He's not that sort of guy. He cuts through the bullshit. One charge that has been brought against the game that might be a result of this is that the puzzles in Full Throttle, well, they're pretty damn simple. For the most part, it's basic inventory puzzles, meaning that, this charge can stick. It almost takes you aback at first if you're used to adventures where you might have to go pixel hunting, or where the odd bit of moon logic is required. There's none of that in this game, but nothing that's going to be a stretch. Of course, whether this is a problem or not depends on what you're into with these games. If you really like complex puzzles, then this isn't the game for you. More than a lot of other LucasArts games even, Full Throttle really thrives on its story. I'd personally rather get on with the story a lot of the time than get stuck with lengthy or taxing puzzles, so I don't really mind this. There is another charge against the game that is a bit more serious, mind: the action sequences. In particular, the fighting on bikes. This isn't the first LucasArts adventure game to feature action. The Indiana Jones games had it, and, well, it was the weakest part of those games too, alas. The fighting does look cool, especially for the time. It uses the Insane engine to put sprites on motion video that had seen use in Star Wars Rebel Assault 2, but it's mainly just button mashing. It doesn't help that I'm absolutely awful at it, I suppose, but I find the middle section where you're trying to fight bikers with chainsaws or those damn cavefish to be a great pain. Fighting with a mouse is just never going to be natural. Of course, one core tenet of LucasArts games is that the player must never be completely stuck. At no point does a player die, nor do they get put in unwinnable situations. So even here, if you're utterly terrible at the fighting, you can just press left shift and V to automatically win. And, yeah, I did that. Sorry, I'm just not that good. Any other issues? Well, it is short. Perhaps too short for some people. Full Throttle clocks in at around about 2 hours, which is perhaps as much as less than half the time of most other LucasArts adventures. If you're not expecting a short game, you may well be surprised when, all of a sudden, you basically find yourself in the final area. Is this a problem? Well, not really for me. I think that for the sort of story the game's trying to tell, Full Throttle's length is about right. It's not an epic. There were plans for other sections, including a peyote-induced trip around the Badlands, but these got cut out. I think if the story had been of the usual LucasArts length, it would have had to include a whole lot of unnecessary padding. So I think that while it's bold to make such a short adventure game in 1995, Schafer and company did get it right. It's possible that others may have felt a little duped though, but on the plus side, there's no part of the game that doesn't feel essential. It pretty much all works and there's little in the way of filler. Now, without obviously spoiling the story, there's plenty of other good things to go into. The voice work is absolutely stellar from everyone, with nothing but quality talent across the board. Aside from Conrad, there's Mark Hamill's sinister Ripburger, Kath Soucie as Maureen, a bit of Malcolm Camp and Steve Blum, the dulcet Maurice LaMarche. It's fantastic all over the shop, not a bad word to be said. The kicking music, mostly supplied by hard rock band The Gone Jackals, is also brilliant. As brief as Full Throttle might be, it grabs you pretty damn quick and doesn't let go. And even though, to be honest, I'll pretty much always be in the Sierra camp when it comes to point-and-click adventures, I've got a lot of time for this one. It's just nice, grounded and fun. And a lot of people agreed. As mentioned, the game was quite a risk. The management at LucasArts really weren't sure about it. In fact, they hated it. They wondered why they'd given Schafer what ended up being a budget of $1.5 million to make the game over the course of 18 months, a very long and quite expensive dev cycle in those days. But Schafer was proved right when Full Throttle went on to sell over 1 million copies, becoming one of LucasArts' most popular games, and allowing him to go on to make the even better loved Grim Fandango. Full Throttle ended up being an important game for LucasArts. Not only did it show that they could make adventures outside of their comfort zone, it was a big game for a genre that at the time was rapidly losing ground to 3D adventure games and first-person shooters. The success of Full Throttle and other games such as Broken Sword signalled a new wave of great adventure games that managed to keep the genre cooking commercially for a good few years yet. Not that it's ever really gone away. Full Throttle's success unfortunately didn't end up with a sequel, although one could have easily been made and was, indeed, quite close to completion. Full Throttle Hell on Wheels, set for release in 2003, was set to be a more action-based game, fitting in with LucasArts at the time. Around 2000 or so, they decided to favour action games over adventures, and as a result a lot of the big adventure names there, including Tim Schafer, had left the company. From the trailer that exists, well, it doesn't look like a particularly good game in all honesty, and ultimately it was cancelled in August 2003, only a couple of months before its scheduled release. There was another attempt a couple of years before that's lesser known, Full Throttle Payback, which would have been a proper adventure sequel that apparently would have featured more from characters such as Father Torque and the What Reel Again. However, this was cancelled in late 2000 without any official statement. One can presume this relates to LucasArts' decision to largely abandon adventure games. Any hope beyond this for a proper sequel, in all honesty, was probably finished by the death of Roy Conrad in 2002 due to lung cancer. As is often mentioned, despite his gravelly baritone and cause of death, Roy was never a smoker. The death of Conrad added to a generally poor reception for the trailer for Hell on Wheels, meaning that most people were frankly relieved when that game bit the dust. Cause hey, what's the point of having Ben without the original actor? Still, the game was given a new lick of paint in 2017 for a remastered edition from Schafer's studio Double Fine. I'm using said version to play the game here, and it's all good, although I prefer the grainier original graphics to the cleaner new ones, as you can probably see. And well, that about does it. No point in dragging things out much more. In the spirit of Ben, that wouldn't feel right. Full Throttle. It's good. I'll see you on the road. Bye for now. The community gives thanks to the following: Adam Schafer, Alex Stocco, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Sawley, Conformist, Daniel Briggs, Daniel David Taylor, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Ghostly Spectre, Gruff and Blackpaw, Hunter, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Durso, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, Josh Jensen, Lee Norris, Mark Johnston, Martin Pataki, Morten Skanin, Nanette McCrone, Nicholas Tristan, Olaf Albin, Peter Jack, Peter Sidorn, Phil Taprog, Pocky Southmaid, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Ryan Burford, Sammy Lee, Samuel Victor, Scott Coulter, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stephen Warner, The Unnatural, Tanyo J, Yucca Operator, and Zach Roach.